At this time, I'd like to call this special meeting to order. I'd like to ask Commissioner Legg if he'd lead us in our invocation, followed by our Pledge of Allegiance. All please rise.
Shall we pray? Father, we thank you for this, another up-and-coming day in Hope Mills. We ask, Lord, that you be with us and guide us this evening through the work that we have to do. We ask that you be with each and every one here tonight, that you give them a safe trip home. We ask, Father, that you bless each and every one and let the decisions that are being made be for the betterment of the town. We'll never fail to give you the praise. Amen.
Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And the flags have been reversed. I didn't want to stop in the middle, but
You're on a roll, Mayor.
we just went with it.
I think the carpet people switched it around.
Yeah, we'll have to.
Didn't notice it.
Yeah, we'll have to remember that before the 7 o'clock meeting. At this time, I'd like to welcome those of you that have come out to attend this special meeting and as far as a workshop on a tree ordinance. And at this time, I'd like approval of our agenda, which has only one item on it, and which is this workshop.
Motion to approve the
Have a
agenda.
motion to approve. All those in favor signify by raising your right hand. Seeing none opposed, at this time, I'll open it up for our workshop. And the first question was, did you bring anything from Mr. Hartzog in reference to this?
I think that the packet that was distributed with suggestions from the North Carolina Department, the forestry folks, was
Is the one
actually what Dan wanted or would recommend as a structure for following, for thinking about
Okay.
and answering the questions that the town would answer to put together its own ordinance.
All righty, thank you. All right, in your package, you do have this information, and it is developing a tree protection ordinance. I guess what we could do, I know that y'all have had this prior because it was sent in, via an email also, but if you'd like to start with the beginning, is there any particular area that any of the commissioners would like to work on as far as what's in this packet? Because there's a lot of information here.
Mayor,
Yes, sir.
I'd like to see us concentrate on MIA areas, that maybe we can get a handle on contractors coming in and tearing all the trees out prior to requesting annexation. And I don't know who we have any authority over that or not.
No, the town's ordinances would not have authority over the MIA because they're still within the county.
Save our time then.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Now, I would
Yeah.
say just in terms of the way it's, I would say in the terms of the way it's practiced, you would probably have very few instances where someone's clear cutting an MIA, because the first step would be the annexation, and then if it's going to be developed, the clear cutting will come probably at the time that they're going to be moving forward with the development. But under a scenario NIMA, I would probably say that you'd have that scenario first. That doesn't mean that someone wouldn't propose to do that, but typically in our experience, the development in the MI typically starts well after they've already been annexed, which puts it under our jurisdiction.
Yeah, the reason I mentioned that, as I said to Ms. Edwards a little bit ago, the time the property is annexed into the town, it's stripped. And then we have Ms. Brown's busy trying to figure out what we're going to do with the water that no longer penetrates the ground there, but it flows off, and we got to find a place to send it to. And that makes her job a whole lot harder than it should be. And maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't know. I'm not a stormwater person, so. But thank you for your information, sir.
Okay,
Yeah, I'm sorry.
discussion.
I'm through.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Larson?
I think one of the main things is the clear cutting, and I know one of perfect example, which is actually in the city of Fayetteville, but it's county property still, is the one across from the new Mercedes dealership up there by Manna Church. When you're over in that area, that big field that was cut right at the light on, is that Cliffdale? And it's under like rural forestry, and it was clear cut by a developer, and he's never replanted the trees. Of course, I'm sure he'll just go for rezoning, but he just went in and plowed through that whole area, but it's in Fayetteville's.
And I did have extensive conversations with the city of Fayetteville. What they have in their ordinance is a small regulation that states that if an area is clear cut and there is no plan to develop within 6 months, then it falls under forestation. And I did talk to their department at length, and they said that they had there was a lot of murky waters in regards to these two different types of development. Mm-hmm. If you have clear cutting for development, and you have clear cutting where there's acres of land that are part of some forestry program, that scenario we have very limited control over. But what gets murky is you have a lot that's clear cut and you know it's going to be developed at some point. Mm-hmm. Where's that middle ground on our ability to regulate it once it's developed, and someone saying that I'm forced in the lot? You're not forced in a lot across the street from the Mercedes dealership, but where's that middle ground? And we do have regulations, even in our current ordinance, that have penalties if someone clear cuts prior to development, where you have to almost plant double the amount you would normally have. But if you're talking about something like Chick-fil-A, they just cleared theirs, but they are basically about a couple of weeks from permitting, and they already have an approved site plan with landscaping and replanting and things of that nature. But the piece that's beside Sonic is a different beast. That was clear cut 2 years ago. Are they going to develop it? I'm not sure, but that's where that murky water comes in terms of the difference between a forested program and a lot that we know is going to be developed. That's where I think the challenge is going to be on how to regulate those.
If you're registered under you're only allowed to cut a percentage, not go in and clear cut every single tree to begin with, is where I'm reading it in that packet that Dan provided us. Wasn't it a percentage, and then it's another percentage another year and so on, and replant, and because you're actually doing it.
In that section, I'm not sure. When I spoke to the city of Fayetteville, they said that the most they've been able to get out of that is maybe a developer preserving a 30-foot buffer around the property. We actually did that with Mr. Gardner's piece on Fountain Lane. So he came in, we kicked in the pre-clearing inspection portion of our current ordinance, and he gave us 2 small clusters of trees and a 15-foot buffer around it. But that's the murky area we're talking about. What authority do we have, and if we do have authority, how do we go about strengthening the ordinance?
Madam Mayor,
Yes, sir.
I think that's probably the point where we need to start is to review and update what our current ordinance states, and then strengthen that from, if it's possible. I think our current ordinance states that it's only sold or developed. Is that right?
It regulates non-residential and mixed-use development, or developed properties that are intended for development. I don't think we have regulations that put landscaping requirements on residential in terms of subdivisions, but most of the language I'm looking at is intended to apply to properties that are cleared for development, and we do have regulations in place for that.
So I'm trying to find the right question to address it. So if the property is sold or developed, then we have an ordinance that addresses clear cutting. And if we do, what does that language state? I don't know. I don't.
Now, in terms of, and this is another thing too, if you're talking about a property that's going to be developed, you get credit for the saving of trees based on your landscape requirements. There are certain landscape requirements that kick in our current ordinance based on the frontage of the lot, based on the square footage of the building that is proposed, and things of that nature. Some of those landscaping requirements require trees to be planted in the right-of-way, and then you have the yard space regulations where you're putting in trees and shrubs in the outside of the setback area, but in the developable yard area. So all of that happens at a situation where you have a property being developed, but if a property developer had the desire to save some trees, he could get credit for a certain number of trees based on the caliber of trees. So that's in place. With respect to just clear cutting in general for a lot that isn't intended for development, that's where it gets a little murky in terms of our.
Kind of use an example, Chancellor. Let's walk.
Let's
start with one.
Let's
and
look
kinda
at
and kind of work our way through it.
let's look at Circle K off of Cumberland and Hope Mills Road.
The corner.
And I'll give you a great example of ways that I think going in the direction you're talking about in terms of strengthening an ordinance. If you look at that Circle K and you look at the Circle K on Glensford and Rayford Road, if you just drive by both developments, same developer, there's about twice the amount of trees and shrubs on that development. Both of these developments were approved through a site plan approval process. So once these things are approved, you have a landscape plan and condition sheets, conditions of development that they have to plant a certain amount of trees based on the development of the lot. Now, at that time, when they're actually they're on the review for development, that's when you have the opportunity to have the conversation with them about their desire or ability to save certain trees and get credit for the amount of trees they will be required to plant as in compliance of the landscaping requirements. So that I wouldn't consider that clear cutting based on the definition of the post I'm hearing from the board. What I think I hear from you guys in terms of the issue of clear cutting is when I go home one day, I come back and the area behind Sonic, beside Sonic, is gone. That to me represents my definition of clear cutting.
Right, mine too.
If I'm talking about Circle K, that's a lot that's being cleared for development.
For development, yeah.
For development. So my concern about the trees aren't as dire because they are actually required to plant a significant amount. But if you look at the development of those same properties in Fayetteville, I do think we could strengthen it to require more trees to be planted back. So that's a scenario where a lot was heavily forested, it was cleared, it was developed, but a significant amount of trees were planted back. I think we can do a little bit more, but I do think we need to be very cautious and not to be too heavy-handed if we're talking about taking that approach.
Clear, Madam Mayor, just to be clear, there's no language in our ordinance that addresses private property.
Basically,
just to be clear, I kind of want to throw that out there on the
it
table.
turns out that may be an area we need to look at strengthening.
Are you referring to like a single family lot that's not part of a development or a subdivision?
Yeah,
Right.
a residential type piece of
Residential property.
Residential property.
That is not going to be developed in the near future.
I'm pretty sure that your regulation refers only to development.
only to development, either being sold or developed for commercial.
Right.
Yeah.
A
That's why
private
I'm-
property owner with their own.
Typically, our ordinance reference residential development. So on that scenario, I wouldn't consider someone that lives in a home that just has an existing tree that needs to be cut. I wouldn't consider that residential development. The landscaping requirements in terms of in general only applies to non-residential and mixed use. So I don't think we have anything in our ordinance that specifically speaks to one individual developed residential lot that has a tree that needs to be cut down. I do know that in terms of tree preservation, we did at least should have language that speaks to if you have a tree that is diseased, or if you have a desire to remove a tree that could potentially fall on your house during hurricane, things of that nature. We should have some allowances to apply that. But I don't think we have language currently in our ordinance that specifically talks of a single residential lot that is actually already developed where someone is trying to remove a tree.
Okay. The reason I asked this, Chancellor, is because on one day, for my example, is there's a 2-acre residential lot that's just been residential for years. I go by it one day, and I see all the trees. The next day I come by it, it's clear cut. And 6 months from after that, there's a zoning application to rezone the property.
Then I look at that as residential development that is covered in our ordinance. Where
But
if,
the property's already been clear cut.
then what happens is in our ordinance, it says that at the time of development, that developer is required to plant double the amount. So there's language in there. And see, that's why I say that's the difference between that lot being developed and the individual lot with a house on it and someone just wants to cut down one or two trees. So there's language in there. But I think what Dan was trying to give us is just, I think what that packet was a boilerplate of options that are available in the state of North Carolina. You guys choose in what direction you guys want us to go in.
So private property owner can clear cut his own private property, but if it's going to be zoned commercial, then he's going to be required to replace a certain amount of the trees that he clear cut.
If you're trying to regulate that scenario, I think you would have to create some language to strengthen the ordinance. Our ordinance simply says when a lot is for residential development, if it's not pre-cleared from a pre-clearing inspection prior to at the time of development, they have to plant double the amount. So if
You see where I'm going,
yeah,
right?
under that scenario, I would possibly asterisk that property. And then when that development comes, after it's rezoned to commercial, have a conversation with the county in terms of the enforcement of it. And at that point, we probably would have the authority to require double the amount of whatever those landscaping requirements would be under the commercially zoned property. But I think we would have to add language to strengthen that.
I can give you an example, a personal example. The Carlene's, my business, the Molder home, was residential. When I came and requested commercial zoning, I was not cutting down any trees. All I was doing was rezoning it, but because of the way I was trying to rezone it, they said that I was making a subdivision because I didn't want to rezone the whole parcel. And that kicked in the subdivision ordinance, which meant I had to plant a hedge row at least 3 feet high behind the Carlene's in front of the other house which I own. Because by changing the zoning,
you have a commercial zoning beside a residential zoning,
and
so it kicks in a buffer.
So we do have something in place that even if you change zoning, that it creates, it triggers that to happen. But I do believe that if I had cut down trees before I changed my zoning, there wasn't anything the town could do about it because it was private residential property. But once that zoning kicked in, it kicked in that ordinance.
Yeah.
And that's what happened, personal experience. And I do believe we've got some things in place, but I think it's more governing commercial than it is residential.
And just to add on what you're saying, there's systems of checks and balances already in place, like with that buffer you're talking about. Mm-hmm. You can actually do a vegetative buffer. If you do a vegetative buffer, it has to be 3 feet at the time of planting, or you can do a privacy fence. If you're doing a privacy fence, you can't alter a chain link fence with the opaque type of things to meet the requirements. So there are some things in place, but I think what you guys will probably need, the challenge is to figure out what direction you guys want us to go in and how heavy-handed or how you want us to do this. But what do we do? Do we just analyze the existing landscaping requirements? Because I think when we're talking about tree preservation, we're saying tree preservation, there is a small section I think it's page 111 in our zone ordinance. This speaks just specifically to tree preservation. But if you look at section N prior to that, it's about 2 pages of landscaping requirements, where it gets very extensive on ways you can regulate the preservation of trees at the time that someone's developing it. So I think maybe we take that approach. That's up to you guys, but find out the areas of concern and see if there's language we need to add. But like I said, it gets very murky if you're talking about a residential, a 20-acre lot that someone's trying to harvest some trees. That's going to get very
Yes, sir.
difficult.
If I could speak, I think we're talking about 2 different things. I think we're talking
Yeah.
about ordinances within our development standards, and then all these samples I sent you guys. This is like the town of Matthews tree ordinance, and this is all this is a tree ordinance, and they talk about on private property. Removal of regulated trees that have been identified by the town have to be permitted to be taken down. If there's
Now, I think what you have with your standalone ordinances like that, Matthews probably has a tree planting list of trees that are required to be preserved. So under that scenario, if you're trying to remove a tree on that list, you have to get a permit.
So I think you'll have to decide whether you want to do a tree ordinance.
Or
I sent you about 4 examples, and also
Yeah.
NC State does a very good job explaining how to go through a tree ordinance.
Yeah, most of those are
the
standalones. I will say, if you're probably moving forward towards a standalone, we need to be careful and not push it to the point where we're probably going to be required to hire a city arborist. One thing Fayetteville does to actually combat that is if there's an issue with tree preservation that rises to the level of needing a professional arborist opinion, that responsibility falls on the developer. So the developer would be required to actually show and prove that if he wanted to remove a tree on that list because it was diseased, he'd have to show an expert opinion on that. But I think I did briefly look at the Matthews ordinance.
We'd be remiss in not mentioning Senate Bill 367 that is still in motion on the tables up in Raleigh.
That's the one pushed by the Home Builders
Hasn't any action
Association.
since April the 9th, but has not been killed. And if that gets approved before we get our ordinance approved, then we'll have to go through Raleigh legislature process.
I think that's the one you sent us. That's the one that's being pushed by the Home Builders Association, which have their own group of lobbyists with their own agendas. But I did have a chance to briefly look at that as well.
Mayor Pro Tem, you're talking about the property owner's rights. You're talking about this one?
I think it is. It's 367.
March 27th,
Is when it was introduced.
2019.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sounds right.
That's what I thought it was.
Sounds
Okay.
right. Yeah.
All right.
So I guess, go ahead.
Sorry. It's just me and Chancellor have had a lot of conversations about this, Hope Mills' ordinance versus the other municipalities we work for and all that. And I think with me and him talking, what it really boils down to is what problem we want to solve with ordinance change. Is it the clear cutting itself? Because right now the ordinance talks about, well, if the site is intended for development or sale is cleared of existing trees without the pre-clearing inspection, whether it's for non-residential or residential, because there's methods to reinstate the landscaping, whether it's for non-residential or residential development, and it's been clear cut without that inspection, then you could solve it by the penalties that are already in the ordinance. If you want to strengthen those penalties, then that would be something you could look at changing. The further problem with that, and this may go back to what the city of Fayetteville has as far as not being developed within 6 months, is if it just says a site intended for development or sale, if I clear my lot and then you come after me, I could say, well, my intent is to sell it eventually. When does that kick in for you all as far as intention of development or sale? If the problem is, well, they clear cut it, Chick-fil-A, for example, now what are they going to go back with? Then maybe tree preservation isn't necessarily what you're wanting to strengthen. Maybe the landscaping requirements are what you're wanting to strengthen as far as how many trees they're required to put for non-residential development. Because right now you require 1 tree for 50 feet of street frontage or 1 tree for 50 feet of building length. If you want more trees to go back, if somebody clear cuts it, even if they got their pre-clearing inspection, then maybe the landscaping stuff is what you want to strengthen and not necessarily
Correct.
the tree preservation, because you have methods to go after people if they don't get the proper clearing inspections or sedimentation and erosion control and all of that. Because in the county, if you clear cut your lot, you clear cut your lot. If a neighbor calls and says, well, somebody cleared 5 acres beside me, what are they doing? Unfortunately, we don't know about it until they apply for development. But what they can do is contact DEQ and ask if a proper sedimentation erosion control plan has been put into place. And if they did not get the proper clearance, then they can be in violation that way. But so I think for me and Chancellor, when we were talking about what we could develop to help you all, it really boils down to what problem. Is it the front end of clear cutting, or is it what the
think it's
lot looks
both.
like once it goes
It's a
back?
little bit of both.
I think it's
I
the
mean,
whole process.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, I think it all started with the elephant in the room, the clear cutting over by Heritage Park. And we got so many calls on that. And so,
Corridor.
I mean, that is what we're talking about, that triggered the whole discussion. So, I mean, there's no sense in,
There's other areas that are contiguous to our town property lines. Down by Sonic, that was clear cut. 162 has been decimated. Don't think that's in the town limits.
No.
It is up for, it was recently rezoned. They're gonna potentially do multifamily there, or residential subdivision.
And the first time that 162 was clear cut, though, they came back and reforested it and it's full of pine trees, and they're all up now. So that there is a whole section of 162 that's new growth. They did do that.
Yeah.
But
And that's what I said. That falls into the reforestation conversation.
You know, if you're talking about, well, I
How they did it.
develop eventually, is that 6 months from now? Is that a year from now? Is that, you know, and right now there's no method of measuring that. We're saying, well, I have an intent on, I mean, they can say, I have intent on doing a 3-acre, 3-lot subdivision in the future for residential development. Well, now I'm only required to put 1 tree back for every lot I do if I clear cut it without the pre-clearing inspection. So it just depends on what you all
And I think back to the piece that Meg talked about across from the Mercedes-Benz, I specifically asked the city of Fayetteville about that, and they said that when they pushed forward or at least tried to enforce it, their attorneys told them because the lot is not being developed and it doesn't, and that's where that 6-month process kicks in, there's nothing they could actually do with it.
and I think the property in question, I don't think he has the intention of it developing.
That goes back to the whole
I think he
definition
just
of
wanted
intended
to
for
cut the trees
development.
in his yard, because that's
Yeah.
my understanding was that's why in front of their house and then the other home they own too. They just cleared the trees. So I don't know
And that goes
how would
back
we
to what
strengthen the ordinance if it's,
I think that's what it speaks to in the Matthews tree ordinance about regulated trees.
Well, Madam Mayor,
Identify
the
what
other
your regulated trees
concern,
are.
the other concern I have is when you clear cut, when does that trigger stormwater concerns?
I think in the type of clear cutting that you see in those scenarios, those are regulated by NCDEQ, I think. Now, we also have regulations in place in our current landscaping requirements that does give credit for people who do more elaborate stormwater systems as it relates to the stormwater and as it relates to the landscaping requirements that would have to come back. So there are things in place already. Do you strengthen those?
Yeah.
But if with respect to the piece of property along Heritage Park, I don't know if we could regulate that because it's not property intended for development. It's probably owned. And he actually, I think I remember him saying something about he was concerned about trees falling over during hurricanes. So if you have someone actually expressing a legitimate concern over safety and things of that nature, and it's not being intended for development, I'm not sure if we have the authority to regulate those.
Well, again, that's a separate tree ordinance, and most of these towns have regulated trees. I don't know what exact criteria is, but we can find
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
That's separate from the development standards.
Preservation,
yes.
yeah, preservation.
And the other tricky thing is, sorry, the other tricky thing is, where do you draw the line of a property owner saying, well, it's an agricultural use and I'm just timbering my property, which is a permitted use in most districts. So where do you draw the line between clear cutting and I'm doing an agricultural use on my property?
Is reforestation required at that point, Betty?
For an agricultural use, that'd be more of a code enforcement question. I'm not sure.
That's something we can look into, but I'm not sure. But that's what I said. That's where that murky water comes into play in terms of what we have the authority to regulate and what we don't with respect to tree preservation on lots that are intended for agriculture and forestation and lots that are intended to be developed for commercial or residential uses.
Chancellor,
Yeah.
Fayetteville requires a site plan for it to be developed before they can clear cut.
Well, what basically happens is you have a clear cutting section, but a clear cutting permit is not required if the lot is intended for development.
They have 6 months, so
That's the 6 month
it's
piece.
the 6 months trigger, or they have to have the site plan already in hand, is what the planner told me.
Yes.
Yeah, so if they have the site plan already and the site plan's approved, then they can clear cut. But I guess that's what happened with the Chick-fil-A on Rayford Road. They went in and clear cut it, and they took down that huge oak tree, and he had to pay a huge penalty, and it also didn't have the permitting for.
And I think that was a lot that fell within. They're trying to develop it within the 6 months. The Mercedes-Benz lot, I think that was clear cut a couple of years ago, and it's still not being developed. So when I spoke to City of Fayetteville, that was that area where they simply could not do anything about it. But you know it's going to eventually be developed. So do you strengthen the landscaping
It's still county
requirements?
property. It's in there. It's still considered county property. Where the across from the Mercedes-Benz, before you get to Old Navy, and right there at Cliff.
I think that's City of
I know
Fayetteville.
the property you're talking about. I'm not 100% sure if it's still the same.
I think that's City of Fayetteville.
I think it's still considered. I think it's in their MIA, obviously, but it hasn't been rezoned. It's still forestry in the county.
Yeah.
So that's where it gets tricky with that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. But we can't control that at that point. It's not. But the stuff that we're talking about is.
And I think that's what, like I said,
Yeah.
Betty and I, we're talking about in terms of what is the issue we're trying to resolve. Personally, as a landscape architect, I'm very concerned with the development of the lot and the way it looks after development with the enhancement of more landscaping and things of that nature. We have regulations in place. Maybe they need to be strengthened. If you're talking about tree preservation and standalone ordinances, that's a completely different conversation.
And I think, and Madam Mayor, and I think you're right, Chancellor, because, and Betty, you're right too. We cannot and should not handcuff a private property owner for cutting down his own trees. He owns the property. I mean, I wouldn't want somebody to show up at my house and say, I can't cut down 2 or 3 trees or 5 trees. I wouldn't want that. Now, if I clear cut that property as a property owner, if I clear cut that property, what is my intent? Betty had it right there. Eventually, I'll probably seek zoning, and I'll probably cut it to market the property. But it will probably be rezoned into commercial. So that would strengthen the landscaping piece. Now, are you going to prevent a property owner from cutting their own trees? Now, if you're looking at tree preservation, there's certain trees that should be exempt from harvesting.
I think City of Fayetteville and a couple of those ordinances,
Like
Commissioner Mitchell submitted, there
Ball
was
cypress
a tree
trees.
list, exempt list and things of that nature. So there's a lot of different, I think that goes back to what Dan was doing with the boilerplate. There's a lot of different ways you can approach this, but I think the ultimate goal is to find out what the issue is here in Hope Mills and what remedies can be put in place to solve those issues.
Well, yeah, and the Sonic property is probably a classic example. Eventually, that's going to be developed, eventually. Now, how that's developed with the landscape footprint is probably what needs to really be addressed.
And if you're talking about City of Fayetteville, that 6 month period was probably put in there for a reason. I don't think it's fair to the property owner to put an indefinite situation where you clear cut it. So if you develop it 10 years from now, we still get to ding you. I think still needs to be a realistic time frame that you have in place. Where that time frame is, I'm not sure. City of Fayetteville chose 6 months.
Yeah, the town of Matthews in the ordinance that you pointed to earlier has 3 years, and that's the example cited by the state. If you come back within 3 years of clear cutting a lot and you want to apply for development, you must meet the standards as though you had never cut down a tree. So that's quite a lot of planting.
Yeah.
And after 3 years, Katie, what happens?
That's
That falls into
murky
the-
waters
yeah.
that,
Yeah.
we're
Because people can look at that and say, I'll wait the 3. Financially, I'll wait the 3. I'll let it sit there. Tick-tock the clock.
And if they, I mean, if it's residentially zoned, because there is there is no landscaping standards in place for residential subdivision. So if I clear cut 50 acres and wait 3 years, but then I go put in 50 lot subdivision, there's nothing requiring me to plant any more trees there ever again. So that may be something to look at. I think the only municipality that we work for right now, Stedman does street trees for subdivisions. But I mean, there is nothing saying if I do like the subdivision behind Seaway and Collier, if I clear cut that, I don't have to put anything back once it's divided. Now, clearly, people who develop subdivisions put trees on lots sometimes, but there's nothing saying they have to.
This just reminds me of a time when you could develop and not have to put in sidewalks.
Yeah.
Just saying that.
But you know, that's a good point, because
It is a good point.
we had to be realistic about the enforcement of those. You know, where is the line on if you're installing sidewalks where it gets to the point where you're stifling development outside of the enhancement of pedestrian balances and things of that nature. So regardless of what we do, I think we need to be very careful to create a balance that preserves trees but does not move in a way that stifles development. That's the only concern I would have with any change to any ordinance, whether it's trees, sidewalk signs, or anything. I think we need to address the issues that we have, but do it in a way that does not negatively impact development.
And then you clear a lot like Seaway and Collier, completely clear cut, and then you've got a tremendous amount of stormwater runoff that floods the road.
I think that's where the NCDEQ aspect comes in, because there are some circles that believe that a lot of the standing water and runoff and things of that nature are increased with lots that are clear cut and things of that nature.
So I don't want stormwater bypassed in the process. I mean, they need to be at the table. They should be at the table. These are just my thoughts, Mayor. And I think that's what we're here for, is to share them. They're all valid thoughts. I think we all want the same thing. It's just a question of how we get there.
And I think ultimately we would need direction on which way you guys want us to tackle this. This will probably be done through a series of work sessions. I think we had 7 for the sign ordinance. But these will be done through a series of work sessions where we come back with some language. But I think we need direction on which areas do you guys want us to start focusing in on. I've looked at ours. I've looked at City of Fayetteville's. I was looking at Aberdeen's, and Mike sent us a couple. I printed all those out. I've been studying those since about 3 o'clock.
Madam Mayor, the
Yes, sir.
town of Matthews, I mean, they actually have their parents and tree committee reviews their tree ordinance annually and comes back to the board with any recommended changes. I'm not saying that necessarily to give it to the parents committee, but to me, I like the town of Matthews. I mean, they've addressed every issue that involves trees, I think.
To
And they're
include the town cutting
probably-
down trees, when the town can go in and cut down trees. They have a way of doing it if they want to cut them down. That was interesting.
But I think, again, whatever which section we look at, I think we just make sure that it's identified as a solution to a problem that we currently have, so that we
And I
don't.
guess that would be the thought, is the reason this all came about was the clear cutting by Heritage Park. So I guess that's where we need to go first, is what do you want to do to address that issue? What language, or where do you want to
Or
send?
can we?
As far as direction, what direction you want Mr. McLaughlin to go in for that one? That was what brought this up. So how do we do that? So suggestions that he can start looking into, what kind of regulations or where you want to go with it?
Well, I mean, I think he knows where we want to go with it. It's a matter of how we go about getting to that point.
But I guess he needs
So-
parameters. You need to know.
Again, I think most of these talk about regulated trees, which is
Right.
predefined by the town. Not trying to create a communist country. And that's not saying that you can't cut down regulated trees, but you may have to replant a certain number of trees or something of that nature.
I think in that particular property, the majority of them were pine trees.
Probably were.
So, I mean, you're looking at longleaf and loblolly pines. So they grow back quickly if you want to replant. But, I know that we would probably protect dogwoods. We might, protect crepe myrtles. But at the same time, oak trees were what the Mill Village has always planted. So there's probably some really, really old oak trees around here. So I don't know how you would decide what trees would be on that list.
Could be age.
Now, I think what City of Fairville did, they chose the North Carolina standards of trees
Okay.
For their tree list.
So
And
that would be a
it basically
suggestion,
refers
maybe
back
that they
to
would
that.
want to go by using that standard.
Yeah, and I think we still need to make sure we understand development, because if we're talking about a Heritage Park piece,
Yeah.
my understanding, you would only require him to replant at the time he's trying to redevelop. If he's not redeveloping, and he's basically saying, I just want these trees gone because I live in this house, I don't feel safe, whatever reason he gave, at what mechanism or what is the trigger that would give us the authority to make him replant if he's not developing that
Or
area,
to prevent from cutting.
or prevent from cutting.
I mean, it's
Now,
very
preventing the cutting would go into the protected
It's the very first
list.
thing, and this information from NC State talks about the very first thing to do is assess and inventory your trees in your community, so you have a baseline for future planning or whatever.
So I think I'm hearing like there's an interest in a tree preservation ordinance to be presented to the board with suggested language. What kind of trees are you interested in preserving? Like large trees lining roadways? Do you want some kind of application process that someone needs to go through before they cut down a tree that's within a certain distance of a roadway?
Yes.
Right, so I'm throwing some suggestions out there, but I'd be interested in hearing what directions the board wants to go. Then we can take it back, we can
Yeah.
put together language, and if there's something that you absolutely cannot do under the law, we can come back and tell you, I'm sorry, but we can't do that.
So even in the NC State information, it talks about the land use classification, standard for saving existing tree canopy, standard for sites lacking existing tree canopy. It's like a little chart there.
And the law on this is kind of evolving. I know that the town of Aberdeen is facing some litigation over its tree preservation ordinance, which is pretty extensive. So,
Chancellor, we
Yeah.
do not have a standalone tree ordinance.
No, we have a
A
section
standalone.
in our zoning ordinance.
We address it and we talk about it in different parts,
There's a
but we
landscaping.
don't have a standalone.
No, there's a landscaping section of our zoning ordinance, and tree preservation is listed as a section of that. But I wouldn't dare call it a standalone. It's
Would the
about
board be
half a
interested
page.
in a standalone tree ordinance as a starting point?
That's what this whole thing from
Yeah.
NC State.
Now,
Would,
one thing I'm talking
well,
about.
it would include that. A tree
One-
ordinance would include preservation.
One thing I'm talking to Betty about, though, I think if we go with the standalone, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that takes it out of the county's ability to regulate during the development review portion, where a property for development is submitted to the county, and they would have that point to enforce some of these things. It would pretty much put it on our end, but I think that kind of creates a very murky situation with respect to.
Well, you'll have it in two places. You'll still have your language in the zoning piece. But what I'm looking at is a separate tree ordinance that includes preservation as a subsection of it.
I think we would have to go to great lengths to make sure you put in there that ordinance would have to be done through a pre-clearing prior to development, or something that gives us the authority to pull them in.
Right, the problem with that would be when we're processing development review or subdivision review or anything for you all, if that's a standalone ordinance that falls under the town's code ordinance and stuff.
They
we
have no authority over it.
Nothing to do with that. So, I mean, we would have to work together on.
Similar to how we did the food truck ordinance. the food truck ordinance was done as a standalone, so that's only done through us.
A number of municipalities have their own separate tree ordinance that also references preservation. I mean, we've got some examples, especially this one.
And I agree with that. What I'm saying is most of those situations don't have intergovernmental agreements for the county to process certain aspects of their developments. That's where,
Like, I worked for Matthews, that's where I came from the town of Matthews. And the difference is their public works, their UDO, their planning department is all done together. The other difference is Matthews, when I was there were maybe 3 or 4 lots that had not been developed yet. They're trying to save the trees in a city that's pretty much already developed, whereas you're trying to save trees for lots that haven't been clear cut yet. There was maybe 2 lots in Matthews that hadn't been completely clear cut
Okay.
when I worked there. So, and in their ballgame, they're trying to save whatever trees they have left in a town that's pretty much been built out. Whereas you have the opportunity to preserve lots of trees, that are already here. So it's kind of different a little bit.
And where the city addresses it is under their UDO.
Right, because they all fall under one. We work together to process development review, whereas everything for them is in-house. So we would just have to make sure
Yeah. that connection would have to be fostered, yeah.
Okay.
See, Betty's already familiar with town of Matthews.
I'm with you. But I still think that's where our starting point is what would be the recommendations? A standalone or?
I would it's back to what problems do you guys want to solve? If you're talking about, I'm not sure. Again, my personal direction would be to attack it from the enhancement of the landscaping section, but I'll follow the direction of the board.
And preservation. Landscaping and preservation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always going to push for preservation. I'm just saying in terms of the proposed developments that we see coming, I think you're getting more bang for your buck, enhancing your landscape requirements. But if you have a serious issue with how many lots are being cleared, similar to what you have with the piece on Heritage Park, that are not being intended for future development. If you have a serious concern about that happening more often, then I think that's where you get your standalone preservation piece in. But that's a decision for you guys.
Okay.
Madam Mayor, ma'am.
Yes, sir.
Interesting.
I didn't know I was going to stir up such a big conversation with that discussion. I'm sure there's a lot more work we're going to have to do that. Personally, I can't see it being resolved tonight. It may be,
Nah,
but
yeah.
I don't see it being resolved tonight. I mean, the clock on the wall says 25 minutes till 7. So I'm ready to move on to something else here if we may.
I think as the attorney stated, give us some direction on where you want us to start. We'll bring some language back. What I've heard so far is what kind of regulations can you put in place to deal with the Heritage Park clear cutting? Do we create a protected tree list? And what type of trees are you going to put on that inventory? I think some places regulate it based on the height of the tree or the caliber of the tree. I think it's a 30-inch diameter of trees in City of Fayetteville. Matthews has a tree protected list. So, but whatever way you guys want us to go in.
Why don't we look at coming back in a couple weeks or our next meeting with some type of direction? Recommendations
Are
for
we going to
change?
give direction tonight?
I mean, we can. I mean, I don't want to do this for 7 meetings.
So is there a way to, when you're talking about private property, basing it on acreage being cut? So because you're looking at when you go over a certain amount of acreage where you might be creating a storm drain issue or erosion issue or something like that, where obviously you wouldn't say, in 3 years, then they turn around and they do another 2 acres, and then 3 years do another 2 acres, and then eventually it's all clear cut again. But so that you'd have to work it so that it's not, so they're just working the system down the line. But but doing it acreage wise and looking at it, because obviously we've had a couple issues like Collier or Sonic where it was clear cut and then we had a storm drain issue because of it being, and they were just pine trees, but because they were cut down, we had serious flooding to the point it took our bridge out down at Sonic, and then Collier flooded out several houses. So is there a way of doing it around, is that one way that we could address private property with clear cutting large acreages? Not the, 2 acre lots or the 3 acre lots. We're talking about, or I don't know how many acres that is, but that was quite a bit.
Quarter acre maybe. Quarter acre maybe. Quarter acre lot.
The whole Heritage Park area?
No, I'm
No, that
saying
was
you
5
start with a
Yeah,
quarter
no,
acre
I'm
lot.
not
5
saying like someone
acres.
who's on an acre lot. I mean, if they want to clear cut their acre lot.
If it wasn't an acre, they're required to work with DEQ to get a sedimentation erosion control plan. Now, whether or not property owners do that or not, we can't, there's no way for us to hamstring them into doing it unless somebody calls us and says, hey, they clear cutted it and they may be a violation.
But then you're late. So what do you do to prevent that so that
Well,
it
I
isn't
think what we could
handled
do
with a
is
third-
possibly contact NCDEQ to see what their penalties and their processes are, because they actually
but
do
how do you
regulate.
stop it from getting to that point? Because then it's already clear cut. It's already done at that point. So can you do it?
Because they didn't grub it.
Yeah.
So the town doesn't regulate erosion control at all. That's done at a state level. We're not delegated authority. I can go out and tell them to stop, but they don't have to listen to me because I don't have any authority to tell them to stop. So we can contact the state, but all of these instances where there is what you're referring to as clear cutting, they're just cutting down trees. An actual clear cut is where they cut the trees and then they remove the stump from the ground. So they're clearing and grubbing.
Yeah.
Anything over an acre would require a property owner, whether it be residential or commercial, to get a permit from NCDENR for erosion control. That still doesn't stop them from removing the trees. It only requires them to put up erosion control measures to stop any type of runoff. What you're referring to behind Sonic, we had 20 inches of rain. Trees or no trees, it's flooding. I mean, that's just, it wouldn't have mattered either way. But I agree with Chancellor. I think that strengthening the landscaping ordinance through zoning is what we have to do, because you're creating an issue with enforcement again, and that's what we have a problem with, is if there's not a trigger, we can't enforce it. It's already been done by the time we see it. Everybody knows we work from 8 to 5 Monday through Friday, so Saturday the trees go down.
Correct.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying.
So you
Is there a
ha-
way of figuring out that trigger before they're able to do it?
Well, and I think
Yeah.
my personal opinion from a stormwater perspective is that you have to do that during development. And if I'm a personal property owner and I want to clear some trees on my property, I don't want to be told by you guys where and how many I can do it.
I'm gonna wait till Saturday and do it.
That's right.
Deal with it Monday.
Thank you, Beth.
Now we see this is not
Yeah.
as easy as
Yeah.
we thought. There's a way we're gonna have to look at this to try to find some language, but in the scenarios that she's talking about, I didn't even realize that that doesn't even technically fall into the definition of clear cutting. If they're just cutting down the trees and they're not actually pulling up roots and clearing and grubbing. So
I think she just gave us our start point.
That's right.
yeah.
I agree.
I do. I really do, Beth. You gave us our start point.
The ordinances, they all work with each other,
Yeah.
so
Well, they have to.
that's the only.
They work in concert. And so if you're going to change something with one, it's going to affect another one and another one. So I see where the start point is now.
We could propose something that's part of your development ordinances, but that is maybe more extensive requirements than what's currently in there.
I asked the
Yeah.
board's consensus for this as a start point for Chancellor.
Okay, board, what's your thoughts?
I agree.
Mr. Legg?
We need some kind of guidance before,
It's just a start point.
Yeah, before we sit here and say this is what we want, we need to know the pros and cons, the advantages, disadvantages, what would be best for the residents, and what's best for the town. So finding that common ground could be sometimes be difficult, and it's still not going to make everybody happy.
We could come back with two different options and then let you guys know, what are the pros and cons of each option. One which is part of the current ordinance but strengthened, and then one which is more of a standalone.
Yeah.
And work, with Chancellor and work on, defining, okay, if we do it this way, who will help us enforce? What problems are we running into? And if we do it as strengthening the current ordinance, here are the limitations.
And adding to that, the tree preservation piece, which is what the concern is more than the way the landscaping side is. It's the actual preservation of those trees that are being cut. So that piece, is that all right then?
And there-
That's good,
there
that's
are-
good. I think coming back with those options are good.
There are civil penalties in this town of Matthews tree ordinance,
Yeah.
$500.
Yeah, because the
We
options address
actually-
both,
yeah.
landscaping and preservation.
I think there's also already penalties in ours because
most
that
of-
was addressed when C. Wayne Collier was clear cut.
Yeah.
And because the way it was done, there wasn't any way we could actually charge them. So,
And I do think City of Fayetteville created a tree fund, so any of those fees that go in. Now I've seen City of Greensboro. This is super creative. Their recompense fund allows them to utilize that money to put in sidewalks. City of Fayetteville has a specific mandate where their fund can only be used to replant trees. But I think a creation of a tree fund or something like that, where you collect those penalties and put some kind of mandate on what that money can be used for, so it doesn't just get sucked into the general fund. If the issue is to replant, City of Fayetteville addressed it where that money can only be used to replant trees.
so bringing back to us, would the next meeting work for you? Having something brought back would that work as far as the attorney would getting something
Yeah.
by the next meeting?
talked
Is that
That'd be
gonna be
2
enough
weeks out.
time?
Is that enough time?
Right. We can have something to discuss next meeting. We may put something together, and then once you have an actual proposal in front of you, we'll find that there's lots of issues to be worked out at that point. But
At least putting something tangible on
something
paper.
that can
Yeah.
spark discussion,
Okay.
and maybe have more concrete examples for the board to consider.
And then would this require, once we make these changes, this going to require a public hearing? Yes, so
Yeah,
we'll have to make
yeah.
sure we can include that in, and then it would have to go back to Cumberland
Planning
County
board
too.
is the enhancement of the zoning. If it's standalone, I don't
Okay.
think we have to do. go
All
to
right,
the
so we
county
just
for
need
that.
to, and probably something that could be brought back at the next meeting would be that timeline. What would have to be done and when, so that it could be accomplished.
Is this something that you all would want on the regular agenda, or do you want to do a special meeting again
I think you need to do a special meeting.
prior to?
Yeah,
Special
Special.
meeting prior
The
to,
next one probably needs to be a
5:30.
special.
yeah.
that works.
Do we have a committee meeting or anything that night? Celebration committee or?
It's tonight. They're meeting right now.
Let's see, the next meeting is, the 23rd, and that is Parks and Rec Committee meeting, at 7. So, I mean, our regular meeting interferes with that. anyway,
5:30.
so- But if we did this at 5:30, again, opposed to do
Okay.
special meeting at 5:30.
Okay, special meeting 5:30, and that would be to review whatever the proposals are.
So I'm afraid that Dan and I are in trial in federal court on the 23rd, and probably I can't guarantee either of our attendance for that.
Okay.
I'm sorry to push out the timeline for our attendance, but is there
What's
a
the next
later
hearing
date
date
that works?
after that?
The next
October
meeting would be
7th.
October 7th.
October 7th then?
Right, if
5:30?
If we prepare something and maybe circulate it in advance of the work session.
That would be
So
awesome.
that everyone has
Yeah.
time to think about it.
Yeah, I think that'll work.
So we won't have any legal representation at the next meeting then, regular meeting?
I need to talk to Dan about what his plans are for that, but I think maybe the thought was that if the meeting starts at 7, we can get from the federal courthouse down here in time, but we wouldn't be able to guarantee it for a 5:30 start time.
So what if we did this? Have the language given to you guys by the next meeting, work session is the October meeting. That gets it in you guys' hands so that you have a good 2 weeks to look it over, and that makes the October work session a little bit more productive.
Okay.
That's good.
So October 7th, 5:30 PM will be a special meeting to go over the tree preservation and,
We'll email
but email the proposal
By the
prior to,
23rd.
the 23rd.
by the 23rd.
All right.
Do we need a motion to bring all that stuff back? Or are we just going to go with consensus?
This consensus,
Yeah.
I think
Consensus.
consensus works. Okay. Alrighty then, so that concludes our special meeting for our
Motion to adjourn.
motion to adjourn, and we'll be starting back at 7 PM.